So today is Super Bowl Sunday. I'm guessing you're not here this morning to put in a plug or a plea or a prayer for your team to win, or to ask me to do that for you. I'm assuming you're not one of the 25% of Americans who thinks God helps decide the outcome of football games. Still, a member who comes faithfully to the 8:30 service, this service, asked me the other day if we couldn't offer a class on prayer for humanists. I don't know if that surprises you. It doesn't surprise me because I know an atheist or two who pray. I know some agnostics and some humanists who pray. We might not call what we do prayer, but I do think everyone prays, just in different ways. I thought I should tell you that right up front this morning. Get right to the point, so to speak. Having said that, I think we all pray. I'll have to define or redefine what prayer is at some point. But before we go there, before we get into what prayer isn't and what it might be, I think you should know a few things about my personal history with prayer. I wasn't taught to pray as a child. No comment. Didn't learn how or where, when, or why to pray. The great thing about that is it allowed me to discover prayer in my own time in a very organic and open way. What some of my colleagues in an ecumenical Christian seminary had to struggle to learn, how to translate traditional religious words into non-dogmatic spiritual language, came pretty naturally to me. During my years in seminary, though, I also learned that my mother, although she had never told me, still recites the Lord's Prayer every night before she goes to sleep. Now, some of you here this morning might be thinking, lucky you. Prayers that never made any sense to me were forced on me, and that's why they have no meaning in my life anymore. I hear you. And I'll even agree with you that it's a strange topic for a humanist service whose premise is there isn't anybody out there to pray to anyway. But our theme this month is prayer and spiritual practice. And as someone raised by lapsed Unitarians, folks who share the fundamental ethic that if our churches exist, they exist to protect the freedom to practice a free faith, then I'm willing or even wanting to wade into somewhat dangerous waters with you this morning. What does it mean to pray? Does it have to mean the same thing it did when you were young? If my mother, a scientifically minded humanist, psychologist, and reference librarian, still has an active, if secret, prayer life, what does that mean about what prayer means? So we're going to wade into these dangerous waters together this morning, but not without backup. There's a little story about John Wolfe, our minister emeritus, I want to tell you. It seems before he came here to Tulsa, so early in his ministry, he was interviewed by a ministerial search committee. After some talking, they said, "We like you very much. We'd like you to be our minister. But there's just one thing we don't understand. Unitarian Universalist ministers are generally thought to come in two varieties, humanist and theist. Which are you?" "That depends," said Wolfe. Shocked by such blatant opportunism, one of the committee members asked, "What on earth do you mean?" "That depends on you," John replied. "If you folks are theists, then I'm a humanist. But if you're humanists, then I'm a theist." You can ask John when you see him next how much truth there is in that story. For this morning, however, assuming that many of you would tell me I don't pray, and that's precisely why I'm here at the 8:30 service, I want to tell you why I do. Not why you should, just why I do. Which means I need to tell you a story. It's a true story about something that happened when I still lived in Maine. I've been thinking about it recently because of the 4 women who were shot and killed just a few weeks ago, a few blocks from my home on East 55th Street. Some of you know I walk in the morning. Walking is one of my spiritual practices. I've been walking for at least 20 years. I guess I've been walking longer than that. But this is a different kind of walking. I'm not the first to use walking as a practice. There's a beautiful and ancient phrase in Latin, solvitur ambulando. Everything is solved by walking. I started doing that kind of walking when our girls were young. Today, I call it a spiritual practice, but back then, I just called it staying sane. Well, on this particular walk, I was just coming to the top of a hill when I heard what sounded like gunshots. I stopped and waited for the silence, the reassuring silence that would mean it had been a car backfiring or a random rifle shot. This time, though, instead of silence, I heard a woman's voice yell, "Someone call 911, help! Someone call 911. Instinctively, I turned and started walking, then running back down the hill towards the woman's voice, thinking those were shots. Those were real shots. Something's wrong. Ahead of me, I saw a young man raising the flag in front of the Coast Guard station, and I paused to ask him if he'd heard the same thing I'd heard, but I didn't wait for an answer. I kept running, and in the driveway at the bottom of a hill, I saw something now. A little girl with her arms stretched high over her head. She was walking away from a house and toward the road I was on. As I ran toward her, I could see she was holding a phone in her hand, and a smaller boy was walking with her. Her eyes locked with mine. Staring into my eyes, she said, "Help me. Help us. My daddy just killed my mommy. My daddy just killed my grandmother." By the time she finished her second sentence, I was at her side. She gave me the phone, and we took each other's hands, and the 3 of us walked into the middle of the road together. As I told the man on the other end of the line that we would wait for him just where we were. I hung up, and the Coast Guard seaman, who had followed not far behind me, took us toward the station. "Let's get you all safely inside," he said. We found a corner of a room to snuggle into, and the Coast Guard guys brought us donuts and drinks. I spent the next hours listening to the girl who was 9 and the boy who was 6 tell me what they had seen. I listened to what they thought was true and what they hoped was not. When they finished telling me about what had just happened, they started to tell me about their mom, about how she told them stories at bedtime, about the songs she sang to them when they had trouble falling asleep, about how she insisted they do their homework, even how she sometimes got angry at them when they didn't, and how she made them clean up their bedrooms. When they ran out of stories and steam, I heard myself asking them, "Would you like me to pray?" And they nodded. I was already in seminary and had just set up a semester of chaplaincy with my local police department, but I had no idea what I was going to say. I don't remember every word, but I said something like this: "Dear God," when you don't know how to start, the simplest words are a safe bet. We're afraid, and we're tired, and we're really sad. It's hard to know right now what's real and what's not. We want all the people we love to be alive. Please give us the strength to face whatever comes next. And thank you for keeping us safe. I remember a long silence and then a few more words coming out. I opened my eyes and looked right into theirs. If I know anything at all right now, I know your mother is happy that you're both safe, that you're both alive. This is such a good thing. Thank you. In that moment, there were so many reasons not to pray. My words couldn't fix anything. A prayer wouldn't and couldn't make any difference in the outcome. I didn't know the right words to use. I wasn't sure how to start, how to end, who to address, or who I was thanking. On the one hand, how could I pray? And on the other hand, how could I not? Maybe you too would have been moved to pray in that moment. What I know today is I'm glad I did. I also know that more than my words, my presence was already a prayer. All my attention and my best intentions were focused on those children in those first hours after they had seen what children should never see. All of that was prayer. All of that was being present to and not turning away from the truth of the violence and the loss. Also being present to and not turning away from the truth of their love in their eyes that was still so real. Prayer is paying attention to what is most real. It isn't begging. It isn't reciting words which have become meaningless, although it can be reciting words which have surprisingly retained their meaning despite the passing of years and the changes in one's theology, as in my mother's case. When I stop and pick the wildflowers which grow along the river, I have an opportunity to pray, is the way I see it. When I bring my attention to the abundant beauty around me, and especially if I dare to express my thanks by saying thank you out loud, or touching the ground, or bowing to the plant, then I'm praying. I'm attentive and acting with intention. What I'm beginning to understand is I've been praying all my life. I just didn't know it. When I stop busily trying to cross things off my list and getting things done and go outside to sit in our hammock, to swing slowly and soak in the smells and sights and surprises of our own little backyard, I'm praying. I know this because when I return to the busy day, I'm refreshed, reinvigorated, renewed. Before I invite someone into my office to sit and talk, I ask that the meditations of my heart, the words of my mouth, the thoughts of my mind all support the presence of compassion, kindness, and understanding. Praying doesn't make you religious, and you don't have to be religious to pray. There are an infinite number of ways to pray, because to pray is a common response to our common everyday experience of existence. The way we pray is shaped by culture, but why we pray is universal. And makes me want to go back to something I said earlier. I told you I was raised by lapsed Unitarians. You've heard of lapsed Catholics, but there are also lapsed Unitarians. What I've come to realize is I'm one of tens of thousands of people in this country, tens of thousands of people who agree with us that there are many paths to ultimate truth, that respect for our differences is a fundamental rule of life, that spiritual truths are embedded in scientific facts, and that when scientific discoveries contradict religious teachings, those teachings must be reevaluated and reinterpreted, if not revised or discarded. For years, I was one of tens of thousands who share our core commitments, are invested in our values, but who do not belong to our congregations. Which means for many years, I was one of the nuns. Not the N-U-N-S, but the N-O-N-E-S. The ones NPR did a week-long series on in January, specifically about prayer. Some of you may have heard it. I see some nodding heads. In an article on the series, a young college student explains even agnostic or atheist carry a lot of cultural baggage that I just don't want to take on. Still, the student reports he prays sometimes when he's faced with a difficult decision or is concerned about a family member or friend. This student, who wasn't raised in a religious household and doesn't think of himself as religious at all, still prays. When the journalist asked if he saw himself as spiritual but not religious, he rolled his eyes and groaned dramatically. "I don't want you to be thinking of me in terms of spirituality or religion." He said, "Not my religion, if I have one, and not your religion. These designations just shouldn't be part of how we relate to each other, no matter how we believe." I hope you'll tell me later if that student is saying something which feels true for you. The point I want to make is prayer is something the non-religious do. Prayer is something we all do. I wish that student were here this morning and we could ask him how he prays, when he prays, what he prays, and why he prays. Does he, like many of us, stand at his kitchen window and watch the birds land on the lawn or on a swinging feeder to marvel at the colors on their wings and to wonder at the miracle of flight? If he does, and if you do, by my definition, then you are praying. You're focusing your attention on what is most real. In the focus of your attention, your intention is to appreciate and respect what is. You're allowing beauty to touch and move you. Perhaps then you feel gratitude or awe or humility. Or maybe when no one's looking, you sink down onto your knees in the grass and marvel how each blade is reaching for the sun, is soft to touch, is so small and still strong enough to survive the weight of your whole body pressing down upon it. You stretch out flat on the ground, rest your face on the earth, and then you start to feel ridiculous. How can you explain to anyone that you're crying over the miracle of a blade of grass? The case against prayer isn't hard to make. And I'm sure some of you could come up here and tell us all why you don't pray. If prayer worked, if God answered our prayers, if God is an all-powerful presence or being or force beyond our understanding who listens to each of us and gives us what we want, then, well, so many things just wouldn't happen, right? Our husbands wouldn't die of cancer. Our nephews wouldn't lose their lives in Afghanistan. Our wives wouldn't leave us. Our daughters wouldn't be addicted to drugs. We wouldn't be having such a hard time going cold turkey with our drinking habit. And so many less and more serious things would happen. We would be able to stick to our diet. We'd have that dream car we've wanted for so long. We'd have gotten that job or been given that promotion. And our best friends and our bosses would have forgiven us. There'd be world peace. All children would have enough to eat, people to love them, safe places to live, good educations, and excellent health care, right? So why on earth pray, Barbara? I can hear you asking me. Don't, I say. Not if you want to change the world, but do if you want to be changed, so then you can change the world. Here's an example, some scientific evidence for what I mean. For 10 years or more, doctors and research scientists have been studying what's happening in the brain when people are deep in prayer or meditation. Notice they don't differentiate between the two. Andrew Newberg, a neuroscientist at the University of Pennsylvania and author of several books, including How God Changes Your Brain, has been scanning brains for more than a decade. He says the more you focus on something, whether that's math or auto racing or football or God, and we could add such qualities as kindness or compassion or generosity, the more that becomes your reality, the more it becomes written into the neural connections of your brain. What's really interesting is that whether Newberg was scanning the brain of a Methodist minister who's had intense spiritual experiences most of his life, even hearing the voice of God, and spending 2 hours or more in prayer every day, or the brain of a doctor who's practiced Tibetan meditation for the last 20 years, a belief system in which there is no God, their brains revealed the very same pattern. The frontal lobe lights up with the intensity of the concentration, and the parietal lobes, associated with a sense of self, go dark. When we unite our attention and our intention, we increase our capacity to feel compassion. It doesn't matter if we're praying or meditating. We are cultivating and developing our deep longing to connect to the world around us, to each other, and to ourselves. And it changes our brains. Our sense of self fades, and we start to feel we're becoming part of the object of our focus. The sunset, the moonrise, the breeze as it rustles the leaves on the trees. We're filled with awe and a sense of radical dependence. We feel something settle into what I can only call our soul. We know we can be kind, patient, and generous. We want to be kind, patient, and generous. When it comes to the brain, Newberg says, spiritual experience is spiritual experience. There is no Christian, there is no Jewish, there is no Muslim. It's all just one. I find this fascinating and helpful. It's fascinating to understand, as we do now, that the brain is changeable, plastic, they say. So we're literally remolded and remodeled by what we think and what we do. It's helpful, if not also a little terrifying, to know that whatever we do every day, if we take a walk, meditate, read or write a poem, write in our gratitude journals, or if we review our resentments, call to complain to a friend, or mentally list all our faults and foibles, we are fundamentally, materially, and mentally, spiritually, and structurally changing who we are. When someone says, I pray, we don't know and we won't know what they mean until we ask them. So I've asked some of you, and I've asked members of our care team, people who represent the broad continuum of beliefs and practices that this church represents and serves, what it means to them. If you're curious about what they've said, you can look in Simple Gifts this month and read their responses to an exercise I led with members in Reverend Tamra's leadership class. And you can also look at the All Souls Facebook page and read people's comments there. It's important that members of our care team who visit people when they're in the hospital experiment with praying. It's important if they grew up like me and prayer territory is wide open and they need signs and fences, maps and directions, or if they grew up praying every day all their lives and have never stopped. It's important for each of us to experiment with different forms of prayer, because in this amazing congregation, we will find ourselves at the bedside or sitting in the pew right next to people with very different beliefs and practices. And prayer is experimental and experiential. So care team members talk about it, and we're talking about it this morning. We talk about the who, the what, the where, the when, and the toughest one, the why. Here's what we've decided together. I invite you to experiment and test these answers for yourself. Anyone can pray. Any words and no words will do. Now that I know my mother loves the Lord's Prayer and recites it every night, and I'm grateful she risked telling me, if I find myself by her bed when she's struggling to live or ready to let go and die, I hope I will remember to say it in French, the way she's heard it and said it since she was a child. Notre Père qui es aux cieux, que ton nom soit sanctifié, que ton règne vienne, que ta volonté soit faite sur la terre comme au ciel. Any language works. Anywhere at all works. Any time of day and night works. Remember, how we pray is cultural. Why we pray is universal. It's a response to life's beauty and betrayals, its promise and its pain. We never force prayer on anyone here in this church, but if we offer, and in that moment someone says yes, then we know why we're praying. We pray because in that moment, we're naming the deepest truth we can touch. With best intentions and all of our attention, we're naming someone's hopes, their fears, their frustrations, their dreams, their anger, and their longing. We're speaking in prayer mode to hear the whisperings of our hearts and to honor the responses we hear in return. And because everything takes practice, we practice together, and some of us practice alone. If you're curious about prayer, I invite you to ask 2 people this week. Do you pray? And what do you mean when you say you do or you don't? I ask that you ask someone you don't know well and also someone that you do know well. If I had walked onto the site of a double homicide much earlier in my life, I might not have prayed. And some of you may still be thinking that would have been a good thing. The prayer I said that day with those children didn't save anybody's literal life. Still, I'm glad I did. It's good to know that today those children are teenagers, alive and well. After the tragedy, they went to live with an aunt and uncle in California. There's power in the spoken word. You may have felt that power listening to a great poet, a great politician, a great preacher, or watching a play. Words focus our attention and our intentions, as do movements. So after sitting in silence and joining with those children in a timeless place beyond words, I wanted to offer up words which hopefully in some small way expressed what those 2 children couldn't say for themselves. Despite everything, it's good to be alive. Our very lives are a prayer then, you could say. And paying attention and living our lives with intention may be the most important prayer of all.